The sky was pitch black and visibility was zero. 2 shots were fired when the signal was received, causing 2 guards to collapse. The shots continued for the next 15 minutes. Once everything fell silent, the radio announced that the building had been cleared and was ready for evacuation. 14 years later, I found myself by the hotel room window, gazing at the sunset and reminiscing about how it all began. I was thinking about how I got here, drinking my vodka. It burned as I swallowed, matching the memories of the past few weeks. But I kept hoping that it wasn't too late. 6 weeks ago, I found out that my wife of 12 years was having an affair. It was an accidental discovery, but it was still a revelation. That's how most clueless husbands find out, by the way. I'm Logan Genia, and I met my wife during our junior year in college. We dated until graduation, and I joined the Marine Corps while she started a job search. I loved her, but I didn't want her to marry me while I was stationed somewhere far away. It seemed unfair to her, so 5 years later, after I'd completed my Marine service, I returned home and within a few weeks secured a good job with a large company in their sales group. It turned out my boss was also a Marine and had a preference for hiring former military types due to our disciplined work ethic. I excelled in my job, making a name for myself during this period. After finishing my Marine service, I came back home and got a great job with a big company in their sales group. It turned out my boss was also a Marine and liked hiring former military types because of our disciplined work ethic. I did really well in my job and made a name for myself during this time. I decided to I dabbled in the dating scene and was pleased to find my college sweetheart Jamie on one of the online sites. She may not have supermodel looks, but she has a great body. She used to do modern dance and kept fit, and she's still got a great shape. She's 5 tall. She has a dancer's physique, with long, flowing, rich brown hair and dark brown eyes. Her smile melts my heart every time I see it. She has a sweet, innocent look, with just enough toneness thrown in. I signed up and got in touch with her straight away. She replied a week later, asking where I'd been and why I hadn't called or emailed her for the last 5 years. If she was this upset at me for not contacting her during my Marine service, she must have I hadn't been missed, which was a very positive sign. Before long, we were dating and essentially picking up where we had left off in college. Within a year, we were married, and a year later, we welcomed our first child, Rebecca. My job was progressing well, even though I found myself traveling more than anticipated. 2 years later, our second daughter was born. Since then, Amy has come into the picture. I've been promoted and we now live in a lovely house in a good neighborhood with excellent schools. I still travel quite a bit, sometimes for 2 weeks each month, but it's a necessity for my job. It wasn't until a few years later that Jamie began questioning when I would reduce my travel. She missed my presence and felt safer when I was home. I told her it was a necessary part of my job and that it wouldn't be long before I was promoted to the next level, which would reduce my travel significantly and allow me to be home more often. She was reluctant to accept this, but she wasn't thrilled to see me go on. Looking back, I should have realized there was trouble brewing, but I loved and trusted my wife and didn't see the initial signs of a problem. The first clue was our arguments over trivial matters. Upon my return home, she would blame me for things unrelated to me. If you were home more, this wouldn't happen. Or we need you here, not gallivanting all over the country. She had a valid point, though it took me a while to realize it. The second clue surfaced when I found some of her new lingerie in the laundry while searching for a shirt. I came across silk underwear and a matching silk top. My wife typically has simple tastes, opting for a t-shirt. She usually wore a shirt and shorts or sweatpants to bed. The only time I bought her something from Victoria's Secret was the one time she wore it. She never wore it again. However, the lingerie I found was unfamiliar, so I assumed she bought it for herself. The third clue was the decline in our bed activity. Our once passionate and romantic encounters dwindled, and she offered various excuses, claiming she was exhausted. At first, I didn't think it was a big deal. I figured things would get back to normal once my travel reduced. I decided to let it go, knowing that pushing the issue would make things worse. But when I found out the truth, it was devastating. I was hesitant to accept it. A mutual friend saw Jamie with someone at a farmer's market, 40 miles away. Our home initially, he thought it was me. He saw them holding hands, laughing, touching and kissing. When he approached, he realized it wasn't me. He sensed something and discreetly walked away, following them for a while until they drove off in a car. I still remember that call. My cell buzzed as I was leaving a meeting. Frank called me and informed me that he had something to discuss. I told him I was in between meetings and couldn't talk, suggesting we could chat later. Frank agreed and asked me to call him at the earliest opportunity, sounding a bit concerned. I told him I would and asked if it was urgent, to which he replied that it could wait. I hung up, not dwelling on the call, assuming Frank would have told me if it were urgent later that evening. He told me it was urgent, so I called him back. I asked why he was calling and what was so important. He took a moment before saying that he'd seen my wife out with another man earlier that day. I asked if she was with a friend. I could tell Frank was nervous, and he had a hard time telling me the news. He said they looked like they were a couple, holding hands, laughing, and kissing. He told me that he'd seen my wife out with another man earlier that day. He said that he was sorry for being the one to tell me this news and that he thought my wife might be having an affair. I was so shocked that I felt numb. I couldn't think straight. I had noticed some clues earlier that made me think the same thing, but I didn't want to believe it. Frank brought me back to reality, saying that I needed to be aware of what was going on. He suggested that there might still be hope to save my marriage and offered his support, telling me to let him know if I needed anything. I thanked him and hung up, sitting on the bed and grappling with the reality or potential cruel joke as I pondered anger. On the flight home, I was even more upset at the thought of my wife cheating. I decided to cool down and think more clearly about what needed to be done without solid evidence. I didn't know where to start, so I called Frank as soon as I landed. I wanted to know more about the man she was with. I needed to protect my daughter from our issues. I wanted to salvage our marriage. Frank advised me. He told me not to do anything I'd regret and said he had a friend who'd been through something similar. He suggested I talk to him for advice on how to handle the situation, pointing out that it was important to avoid trouble or making things worse. Frank's advice was really helpful, and I realized I needed guidance from someone who'd faced a similar situation. At the time, the best course of action was to head home and act like everything was normal. My advice is to head home and act like everything is normal. If she suspects you're onto something, it'll be tougher to gather evidence against her. I hope I'm mistaken, but I'm certain about what I witnessed that day. Frank was right. When I got home, I managed to compose myself enough to behave normally around Jimia and the girls. It wasn't easy, but I somehow pulled it off. In the following days, I looked around the house for any clues about her affair, but I didn't find anything yet. I had this feeling that I might be missing something. Frank called and suggested I talk to his friend. I agreed to meet them at a bar across town the next day after work. I kept it from Jimia by mentioning late meetings in the dive bar. I found Frank and his friend. Frank and his friend Mark were in a back booth nursing beers. Frank looked up as I sat down, and Mark greeted me as the friend Frank had mentioned. We exchanged greetings, but neither seemed thrilled to be there. Mark spoke, having been briefed by Frank on my situation. He empathized with my feelings but warned against making the same mistakes he did, sharing his painful experience of revenge. He ended up serving 5 years in prison and losing everything in the divorce and lawsuit against his wife and her boss. He warned me against doing anything foolish. His gaze was intense, so I simply nodded, curious about alternative approaches. I asked him what he would have done differently. Mark admitted he'd still go after the boss, but in a subtler manner to catch him off guard. He had a lot of negative feelings towards the man who stole his wife. He also felt negatively towards his wife, but now he'd do things differently. We talked about the best way to handle my situation. The first thing I needed to do was get proof of my wife's infidelity. That way, I could prove it if she denied it. The second thing I needed to do was talk to a divorce lawyer. I needed to understand my rights. The third thing I needed to do was to keep a good amount of cash on hand in case she found out what I was doing and froze my accounts and credit cards. Finally, I needed to find a place to stay in case I decided to leave. All of these things were important, but they were just suggestions. I thought I could sort it out through talking, but as soon as I mentioned this, Mark slammed his fist on the table. He said it was important not to do anything stupid, pointing out that her new boyfriend might be filling her head with nonsense. He suggested that before I approached my wife, I needed to understand what she had been told and what she believed. Mark drew parallels to my military background as a Marine, highlighting the significance of good intelligence in battle. He stressed the need for a plan of attack and a strategy for when things go sideways, emphasizing it was important for me to know which way forward. His question about my military service caught me off guard, so I confirmed that I was a Marine. I questioned the relevance, and Mark continued to stress the importance of having a plan and strategy. He drew connections to my current situation. I sighed, struggling to accept the possibility of my seemingly happy marriage coming to this. Mark apologized quietly, and we sat in silence until Frank broke it by asking about my plan and how I wanted to handle the situation. I realized the necessity, so I expressed my desire to salvage my marriage if possible, but more than that. I made it clear that I wanted to get proof and intel on my rival without risking my own freedom. Mark smiled at my last comment. He said he'd had a bad experience hiring a private investigator. He'd tried to access her bank accounts, credit cards, phone records and so on, but it hadn't worked. He suggested checking for unusual purchases or calls. He also said I should look into the possibility of a second cell phone and set up hidden video cameras around the house for both visual and audio recording. Despite the discomfort, I agreed. I was determined I told him to pay up. We chatted for another hour, during which I made mental notes of the advice Mark gave me. He said it was important not to discuss the situation at work until I'd identified my wife's potential lover. He said there was a risk that someone who knew my schedule might catch on. He also said he would have approached his wife's lover more subtly, which made me even more determined to devise a plan to outsmart this person. However, I needed more information and assistance. So, the next workday, I looked at my upcoming travel plans for the next month and saw that I had a 2. I was worried someone at work might know my schedule, so I spoke to my boss about extending the client visit to a whole week. He was happy for me to do that, so the next step was to create the illusion of being away while secretly returning. I bought a return ticket on another airline online and got some spy cameras. I also got a regular camera with a powerful zoom and good low-light capabilities. This was the first part of my plan to find out who this person was. The second part was to catch them in the act on video, so there would be no doubt about her infidelity. My day was spent planning and plotting meticulously, which I'm good at. But I still didn't know who the person was. I couldn't trust anyone, not even my best friend and boss, Hal, until that was resolved. I knew it would take time to find out who it was, so I stayed determined until the weekend. By then, all the ordered items had been delivered to Frank's home. I just needed the chance to put the spy cameras around my house while Jim was doing his Saturday shopping with her girls and mother. After a few hours, the house would be empty. All the cameras were in place and tested. I could even monitor them in real time from my tablet or laptop over the internet and observe what was happening with the cameras installed. I proceeded to search the house for clues. Initially, I checked the credit card bills for any unusual charges. I then inspected her closets to see if she had purchased any new clothes. I also noticed some newer items, including a very short red dress I'd never seen her wear before. The idea of her wearing it for anyone but me bothered me, even though I didn't have any concrete proof. The red dress was a departure from her usual attire, which made me think. I decided to go for a 5-mile jog. I put on my running shorts and shoes for a long run, which usually calmed my mind and gave me clarity when I got back. I saw Jamie's car in the driveway, so I knew my daughters were home. Their voices and laughter always made me smile. I called out to Jamie, and my girls came running from the family room to share there. When Jamie came out of the kitchen, he asked about my run and gave me a kiss on the cheek before sending the girls off to play. After dinner, which was pork chops, I had a shower and put the girls to bed in the family room. We watched TV, but I was too distracted by thoughts of Jamie's actions during my trips to pay attention to the screen. I felt overwhelmed. She announced an early bedtime and retired to our bedroom. She noticed Jim's purse on the hope chest and took a chance and searched for clues. She discovered a cheap cell phone she didn't know about. She turned it on, recorded the number and reviewed the call log, finding only one unfamiliar number, which she also noted. She powered off the phone. This newfound evidence finally made her realize that she needed to accept the truth. I had to accept the fact that she was having an affair. I was heartbroken and consumed with a desire for revenge. I remembered Mark's advice not to act impulsively and resolved to be patient. I went to bed pretending to be asleep when Jamie eventually joined me. I avoided conversation to prevent unintentional revelations. The next few days were challenging. I was trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy after. As the morning of another business trip approached, I went through my usual routine of packing my bags into the car just before heading out. I casually asked Jamie if she had anything special planned during my absence. She gave me a strange look as she mentioned the usual routine. I quickly bid her goodbye and drove to the airport, wondering if the cameras in our house would capture her with the person involved, despite hoping for her decency to refrain from bringing him into our bed. I became increasingly certain that before all this, she would never have cheated on me. I finished my work with the particular client in record time and packed up, preparing to return home that evening. I monitored the video feeds from the cameras. But I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, so I decided to check out some earlier recordings. The system started recording when someone came into the room with the cameras. All the footage is stored in one place and can be accessed remotely. As I fast-forwarded through that day's recordings, I saw a moment when Jamie was on her secret cell phone. I paused it and played it back at a normal speed. The audio quality was poor, but I could make out enough. She was speaking to someone and calling them baby. They discussed my absence for the week and the logistics of meeting up at a motel. I wanted to hear more, but she laughed and turned her back to the camera, making it impossible for me to catch the rest. When she turned back, she continued giving instructions to the person to park. I went down the street to a coffee shop a few blocks away. "Okay, baby. I can't wait. I'll see you tomorrow night." My wife, the mother of our 2 children, was betraying me. Why was she doing this? What had driven her into the arms of another man? The flight back home was too quick. I wasn't ready for what awaited me, so I checked into a hotel and thought about my next move. I knew tonight was the night he was coming to my house and I wanted to see him with my own eyes. Was he someone I knew or someone from work? I needed to know a lot of things to help me decide how to proceed, but I had no idea what time he'd arrive. I knew he was going to park at the coffee shop down the street, so I waited there, even though I had no idea what he looked like. To be safe, I rented a car at the airport and found a spot with a good view of the parking lot. I brought my camera and checked the zoom quality. I could be at least 100 yards away and get I got a view of his face and license plate at around 9:30 p.m. A silver BMW M3 pulled into the car park. I started taking pictures and, thankfully, the lighting was good, so I had a clear view of his face. He wasn't someone I recognized. He parked on the other side of the car park, away from the coffee shop, and then started walking towards my house. I took a deep breath to calm down while sitting there, and then I accessed the Wi-Fi. Fi from the coffee shop was watching the cameras in my house. After a few minutes, I saw him come in and kiss my wife passionately. I kept calm and listened to them talking. He told her what he thought about her all day. They also talked about having the house to themselves until the next morning. She'd sent the kids to her parents for the night. He wouldn't be back until Friday. I thought it was pretty considerate of her to send the kids away. I watched as he started undressing my wife right in our living room. Reed reciprocated, and in just a few minutes they were both undressed with their hands all over each other. She suggested taking it up to the bedroom and they both ran out of sight of the camera towards the stairs. I listened to their laughter and realized I needed to act fast. I got out of my car and walked. I quickly went down to my house. The front door was left unlocked, which made things easier for me. I went straight for his pants and found his wallet with all the necessary information. I also found some extra items. With his wallet in hand, I went to my home office on the first floor, which is opposite our bedroom. This way, I could minimize the risk of being hurt. I switched on my computer and printer scanner. I waited for them to power up. Once they were ready, I began scanning items from Stephen Bannister's wallet. I copied his driver's license and other details. After returning the wallet, I took pictures of their scattered clothes and started recording what I was witnessing with the camera's video feature. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard faint sounds of their lovemaking. The bedroom door was wide open, and they seemed to think they had the house to themselves. I slowly made my way toward the bedroom, and their voices got louder. I found myself in the doorway, observing Steve on his back, undressed. My wife was on top in the classic 69 position, pleasuring each other. They were so engrossed that I managed to get a few steps into the room unnoticed. I knew the hidden cameras didn't offer the best definition, so I recorded several minutes of footage before resisting the urge to grab a baseball bat and attack him. Mark's wise words echoed in my mind, "Don't do anything stupid." So I backed out slowly and left the house, driving back to the hotel. My mind was a mess, and the hate I felt was at an all-time high. I was really angry. I'd never been this mad before, and it was starting to scare me. I called Frank to tell him what I'd done and what I'd learned. Frank said I was right to do what I did, but he was worried about me going back to the house. He said sorry for the situation and that he'd do anything he could to help. I thanked him and said I needed to talk to someone and ask Mark for a favor. Frank said he'd arrange a meeting. I met up with Mark at the weekend because he'd said he'd help after our chat with Frank. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I decided to go for a run to clear my head and work off some of my anger. It didn't really help, though. After my run, I had a shower and then a long nap to make up for not sleeping well the night before. I took the rental car back to the airport and picked up my own car and headed. I went straight to the office to check in and have a chat with Hal. I needed to reduce my work-related travel, so I told him about my situation. I mentioned my wife's desire for me to be home more and expressed the need for changes in my travel schedule. I was waiting for his response when Hal told me that my promotion had been approved and I wouldn't have to travel as frequently anymore. I was relieved, although I couldn't fully grasp it at the moment. My mind was consumed by the knowledge of my wife's affair. Hal noticed my distraction and expressed concern about my recent behavior. I felt compelled to confide in him about what I had discovered. I told him about catching my wife with her lover and recording them together. Hal reacted with shock and sympathy, offering his support. I explained that I needed to be home more to salvage. I asked Hal to keep the situation confidential, as I was worried that someone in the office might have leaked information about my schedule. Hal agreed to cover for me if I needed time off to gather evidence against my wife. I told him that I wanted to confront her with proof that was impossible to deny, either to salvage the marriage or to protect myself in a divorce. Hal nodded in agreement, promising his assistance and discretion. After thanking Hal, I left his office feeling a bit relieved that things were falling into place, even though deep down I knew my marriage was beyond repair. I left Hal's office feeling a bit relieved that things were falling into place, even though I knew my marriage was beyond repair. I went home that night and tried my best to act normal. My girls attacked me as I walked through the door, and I had to keep from crying, thinking about how they would be affected if a divorce were to happen. I didn't like the idea of having to get permission to visit my own children. I have to get custody of my. I met with Mark and Frank at a diner on Saturday while my wife and kids were out shopping. I updated them on the progress I had made in gathering information. Mark was impressed and said he was surprised I hadn't taken more drastic action. He then asked how he could help, mentioning Frank's mention of my time spent in prison. Both Frank and Mark were curious about my plan for the next hour. I explained my plan and outlined what I was hoping to achieve with Mark's connections when I finished. He smiled and said he admired the plan. He knew someone who could potentially help me and suggested they might be able to recommend others, but he said they would likely expect payment. Mark agreed to make some calls to his contacts. I gave him my cell number and asked him to contact me once he had spoken with his friends so we could arrange we met up to finalize the details and discuss a few more ideas. I planned to implement them as soon as possible. I realized I needed to make some additional online purchases to prepare for the next phase of my plan. The rest of the weekend went as most weekends do, with one noticeable difference. Sunday night is usually our night, but my wife wasn't feeling well. It wasn't the first time this had happened, so it was. It was no surprise that it had been over a month since we'd had sex. My next trip was coming up, so I asked how things were going for the following week. I was told that anyone calling the office should be told I was on a normal business trip. He had no problem with that and wished me luck. I then had to let my wife know that my next trip was going to be longer. She wasn't happy, but that was to be expected. I reassured my wife that my frequent traveling, I told her it would be over soon and that I'd be home more often. I joked that she'd get tired of me being around, but she didn't respond with a smile. Instead, she sighed and told me to call her when I arrived at my destination. She seemed distant, and I got the feeling that our marriage was coming to an end. I rushed out the door before I said something I'd regret and drove to the airport. The meetings with the clients went really well and we reached an agreement early, so I was able to fly back a day sooner. I kept checking the cameras during the week, but he didn't reappear at my house. However, I did see her on her secret cell phone, so I listened to her conversation and I knew this was the opportunity one was looking for. Even though it was hard for me to hear what she was planning to do, I went to the office and found I had ordered some items that I knew would be waiting for me. My wife's normal routine meant that I could easily set up one of these items with little chance of being caught. She went to the gym 4 times a week and I knew where and when, so I had spare car keys and was able to place the item where she wouldn't find it next. I went to Steven's condo to see if he was there. I saw his car parked in the carport, so I assumed he was home. I brought my camera. I checked to see if I could see him inside. I was really lucky because I saw him through his sliding doors. He wasn't alone, he was with another woman. They seemed to be in love, kissing and touching each other. It was too good to be true, so I took a video of them together. When I saw them leaving, I followed at a safe distance. They went for lunch, which gave me a chance to place the other item on his car. This was a little more difficult and dangerous, but I managed it without being caught. Now all I needed to do was wait. I had a chance to place the other item on his car, which was a little more difficult and dangerous if someone saw me, but I managed to do it without being caught. Now I just had to wait. That was the hardest thing for me to do. I received a call from Mark, who told me he had a friend who could help with my plan. We decided to meet in my hotel room to avoid being seen together in public, given the nature of the activities we were planning. When they arrived, Mark introduced me to Joe, a computer hacker who could help with our scheme. Over the next hour, I told them about my wife's affair and how I wanted revenge against her lover. I also showed them copies of the contents of the man's wallet that I had obtained. Joe asked about the legality of our plan and what he would get out of it. After thinking for a moment, I offered Joe $5,000. He agreed to the terms but wanted half up front and the rest when the job was done. We talked about getting into the guy's condo to get his computer and more evidence against my wife using the intel I had on Steven. Joe used my laptop to look at his recent purchases. The 2 airline tickets to Vegas and a hotel reservation for 5 nights stood out. This led to us deciding to break into his condo. Joe asked if I knew whether there was an alarm system. I said I wasn't sure, so he agreed to find out and let me know if there was one. He also wanted more money for helping us get in. I said I'd pay him more if he could prove it was worth it. It seemed like my wife was planning one last trip with this guy. I checked my tablet to make sure the tracking devices I'd put in their cars were working. I could monitor them from my tablet or phone. I also checked the home video cameras to see if she'd packed a bag. On the day of the trip, I kept an eye on things from my hotel room. I gave Joe a call and he said he'd meet me later that afternoon. He hadn't spotted any visible alarm systems, but he said we needed to be careful. We met a few blocks from Steven's condo and went over the plan for getting in. Joe was drawing up a diagram. Given his experience of prison, Joe was confident in his lock-picking skills. It was just after sunset, and the growing darkness would help us maintain discretion. Joe had brought his laptop and a messenger bag, as well as my camera, to the front door of Stephen's condo. He immediately knelt down and worked on the locks for almost a minute. Before long, the door was open. We went in first to check for any signs of an alarm system. There wasn't one, so we found Stephen's computer. It was open, so Joe could get to it. I said, "Wait a minute," and started recording a video of the room. I wanted to make sure we left everything as we found it. Joe nodded and said it was important to leave no traces. He went back to work, and I looked for anything that could incriminate him. I looked through his mail, including bank statements and credit card bills. I also went into his bedroom and took some video footage. The room was very clean and well kept. The expensive furniture made me think of Joe's exclamation of "pay dirt." I went back to the living room to see what he'd found. He'd accessed Stephen's online bill payments and found checks and extra credit cards. I was pleased I'd brought a card reader to record information from the magnetic strip. Joe said he'd make copies for online purchases, which could max out his cards in a few hours. He grinned. He asked if it was possible to empty out the man's bank account. I confirmed that it could be done, intending to carry out the transaction from the man's computer to make it seem legitimate. Joe mentioned the possibility of the bank calling to verify the transaction, but assured me that no password was necessary as I had already copied the man's social security number from his wallet. I laughed at the man's carelessness and gave Joe the go-ahead. I suggested emptying his bank account immediately and sabotaging his credit cards on the day of his return from Las Vegas. Joe was really enthusiastic about it, calling it a fitting homecoming gift. He emphasized the importance of covering our tracks. To avoid any problems, I told him we were taking precautions to avoid detection. I pointed out the latex gloves we were wearing as evidence of our caution. I went back to search through his bedroom and didn't find much until I looked in the back of his closet. I found a shoebox with several recordable DVR discs. The discs were labeled with the names of women. As I pulled out the box, I dumped it on his bed and started to sort through them. I didn't recognize any of the names until I saw Jamie. That idiot had recorded the two of them together. Joe called me over to the other room to show me something he had found. He explained that the guy we were after was involved in blackmail. There were loads of videos of women with Stephen. You could see their faces, but Stephen's wasn't always visible because of the camera angles. Some emails said the women were being extorted for money with threats of using the videos against them. Court, Joe thought that Stephen might have targeted married women with children because they were vulnerable and he could exploit that for his own gain. I asked Joe if Stephen kept all the videos on his hard drive, but he wasn't sure. He suggested that the DVDs found in the closet might be the only copies. I went to get the DVDs and look for a backup drive, but I couldn't find one. I went back to Joe and told him that he'd found the backup drive after I'd told him to do a full backup and wipe the laptop's drive. I explained our plan to bankrupt Stephen by ruining his blackmail scheme. I also told him that I wanted to tell the women involved. I told Joe that they were no longer under threat. I asked him to print out all the relevant emails so I could set up an email account to communicate with them. He offered to set up the account from Stephen's computer, and I agreed to the idea. After wrapping things up, I did one last sweep of the place before we locked up and left. When we got back to the cars, I gave Joe the rest of his payment in an envelope and thanked him for his help. We shook hands, and he said he'd be ready to start the next part of our plan when I needed him to. Then he drove off, and I went back to my hotel to keep working on my plan. I called my in-laws to check on my kids and my dad. I also wanted to check on my children and my father-in-law. I called my in-laws to check on my kids and ask how they were. I told him I hoped they weren't causing any trouble. He said they were behaving well and mentioned Ja's weekend trip with her friends. I said I hadn't spoken with her yet, and that I wanted to make sure the kids were settled before contacting her. After our conversation, it was clear that Jamie's father didn't know about her affair in Las Vegas. It made me even less happy about her. I then called the house, knowing she wouldn't be there, and left a message. After an hour, I called her cell again, but she didn't pick up, so I left another message, saying I was worried I'd called the house and she hadn't answered or called me back. I asked her to please call me so I knew she was okay. I also said that if I didn't hear from her within the hour, I'd call her parents. 15 minutes later, I got a call from her. I got a call from Genia. She asked if everything was okay. She said she'd tried calling the house but there was no answer. I told her everything was fine. I'd taken the girls to my parents' house after spending time with friends. Jim's response was a bit tense. I suggested we have a night out together once I got back home in a week. But she didn't seem sure. She sounded a bit suspicious. I teased her a bit and made her nervous. She said she was tired and hinted. I said goodbye and told her I loved her, but I was still angry. I didn't sleep well, so I went for a run in the morning. When I got back to my hotel room, I had a nice long shower. I called the office to see if there was anything I needed to do, but everything seemed to be going well. Then I got the call every parent fears. Rebecca was injured at school and I was so worried about my child's safety that I didn't think about anything else. The school called my house first, but there was no answer. They tried to call me at work, and then someone from my office called me. I called the school back and they told me she'd broken her arm and was at the emergency room. I rushed out and went straight to the hospital. When I got there, I called Jamie's cell and left a message, telling her to call me. The next call I made was to a divorce lawyer. It was an hour later that my cell rang. I saw it was from Jamie, so I rejected the call. I sat with my daughter as the doctor set her arm in a cast. She was crying, saying she wanted mommy. I wanted to comfort her, but I didn't know what to say. It took some time, but she finally settled down. I took her to her grandparents. My phone rang again and again. I rejected the call when I had calmed down. I made a call to a good divorce lawyer and set up and I made an appointment for the following day. Then Jamie called again. I took this call. She greeted me sarcastically, commenting on my supposed luck at the blackjack tables. She informed me that she had contacted a divorce lawyer. She was crying. She threatened to use the video she had of me and Stephen together as evidence to gain full custody of our children. I reminded her of her absence when our child was in the hospital crying for her mother. She was with her lover in Las Vegas. I reassured her. I suggested she said she could start a new life with Stephen and potentially have more children. She said she loved me and wanted to be with me, but she was confused. I ended the call because I couldn't handle the emotional turmoil. I took Rebecca and Amy home and helped them pack their bags with some clothes. I took them to my hotel and got them their own room next to mine. Then I called Jamie's father and told him what happened at school. I said that for the time being, we won't be living at home until we can resolve some things. My in-law called to ask about the situation between me and Genia. I told him we were having some problems but suggested he speak with Genia for more details. He said he'd be taking care of the girls for now until he was sure of their well-being. He said he hoped we could resolve our issues and wished us the best, although he didn't fully understand. I then contacted my lawyer and instructed him to proceed with serving my wife. I called Mark and instructed him to wreak havoc on Stephen by maxing out his credit cards, emptying his bank accounts and damaging his credit. Later that night, Genia called me in distress. He was initially hesitant I eventually replied after getting a text from her. She was really upset and said that Stephen was blackmailing her, threatening to share videos of them from Vegas with others. I was pretty cold in my response, suggesting that she had brought this upon herself by engaging in the affair. I hung up, knowing that Jamie needed to face the consequences of her actions. She had chosen to leave her home and marriage for her own reasons. I was pleased to see that she would have to face the consequences after deciding to end things with Jamie. I needed to address her lover, Stephen. I called Mark and told him that I had contacted my lawyer to have Jamie served with divorce papers, which would take a few days. Meanwhile, I wanted to move my money offshore to ensure that only my funds were protected. Mark questioned my decision, but I assured him. I told Mark that I was done with Jamie and was determined to give her what she deserved. Mark suggested a change in plans and suggested meeting at 5. We met at a bar and had a long conversation that lasted almost 2 hours. We shook hands and I gave him a substantial envelope for the next 3 days. Jamie kept calling and I kept ignoring her. I wanted her to suffer on Friday evening. I got my wish. I was really looking forward to this call. It was a video call, and when I answered, there was a man tied to a chair and all bloodied. A voice in the background told Stephen that his friend had a message for him. Stephen was looking at the screen when he was addressed by someone who mentioned his recent trip to Tijuana and the exhaustion that must come with it. The speaker also mentioned Stephen's financial troubles. He said that his current situation would help him hide from the bank. The speaker then mentioned someone named Santiago and his special stew, which seemed to hint at something sinister. They explained that they could have pursued legal action against Stephen for alienation of affection, but decided not to waste their time. The message ended with a farewell to Stephen, indicating that someone named Mr. Lopez I saw Stephen for the last time that day. In his eyes, I saw fear. I'd made a good investment. Stephen was still alive when he was lowered into the giant blue drum filled with Santiago's special mix. No one ever heard from him again. No one even asked about him. 7 months later, I was a free man. I got custody of my daughters. I get to keep the house until both my daughters are. Then we can sell and split the difference. There was no alimony or child support. I didn't want anything to do with Jamie, but she has visitation rights and I usually drop the daughters at her place and drive away. A year later, I started dating Lisa. She was previously Amy's school teacher, and it seems that Amy likes her company more than her mother. I haven't decided on getting married yet and I'm taking this slowly.